Hello, this is Josh Lewis. Today I'm interviewing Pat Taylor. It's August 6th. We're in her home in Washington, D.C. This interview is part of the D.C. Gardeners Oral History Project and is sponsored by the Neighborhood Farm Initiative and the D.C. Humanities Council. I'd like to thank Pat for being here with us today. So can we kind of start early in your childhood? Could you tell us where you were born?
I was born in Vermont, northern Vermont.
Northern Vermont, all right. And what's the name of the town or city you were born in?
Well, I was born in St. Albans, Vermont.
Okay. And did you have, were you a single child? Did you have brothers and sisters?
No, I'm one of four. I'm the second child.
Okay. And what did your parents do mainly for a living?
Well, that's really hard. I can't really answer that question.
Okay, that's fine.
Although I will tell you that they both had college educations.
Mm-hmm. And so how long were you in Vermont?
Until I finished high school.
Okay. So
Then I went to college and I never went back to Vermont.
That's a good amount of time. So
Yeah.
do you what do you remember about Vermont growing up? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of differences from when you grew up to when you left, or did it seem like it was growing, or?
No, I lived in a village of 1,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
A farm. It was was the business center for the farms around there. So on Saturdays, farmers used to come into town to do their shopping. Some of them actually came in horse and buggies to do that.
Mm-hmm.
The businesses in that town principally involved lumbering, because there was a plywood factory and there was a furniture factory, both of which closed a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And then a big grain elevator, which is still there. But 1,000 people is not very many.
Yeah.
So it was when I was small, it was a really nice town to be in. You knew everybody and everybody knew you. It was really a case of, as Hillary Clinton said, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, everybody looked out for the children. So it was a very, very safe and nice place to live. And my mother didn't worry much about us, so we could roam all over. We could go into the woods. We could go out into the fields. It was very nice.
That does sound nice. So did your family have a garden when you were growing up?
Yes. My mother had a vegetable garden, and she also had a flower garden. And my grandmother had a flower garden, but I never gardened as a child. But I did used to weed my grandmother's flower garden, so I knew enough to do the weeding.
Hmm.
But I didn't garden.
So do you remember what vegetables your mother had in the garden, or?
No, I don't really remember. But in the summer, we used to spend often in the town in southern Vermont, at my mother's family's home, and my uncles and my grandfather had vegetable gardens. I particularly remember that they had cucumbers,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm sure, and dill, because they made dill pickles, and tomatoes, but I don't remember after that.
Yeah. Okay. So in Vermont, do you remember? Well, it sounds like your family grew some of the food that you ate. Do you remember what types of stores or markets or things that you used to shop at growing up?
There weren't very many shops.
Mhm.
There was an A&P grocery store. There was a meat market. And that was about it. That was it.
Yeah. Okay. So where did you you didn't really garden much as a child. You said
No.
you left at about 18 to go to college.
Mhm.
What college did you go to?
I went to Antioch College in southwestern Ohio.
Southwestern Ohio. All right. And so you spent about 4 or 5 years there.
Mm-hmm.
And where did you move to after college?
Oh, I went to Europe for 4 years, and then when I came back, I went to graduate school.
Where did you go in Europe?
Well, I ended up, I was there for 4 years, so I was in different places, but I ended up working for the U.S. Army in Europe, and I worked for them in both Germany and in France.
Mm-hmm. Was there? Did you get in any gardening or no? Weren't that
No.
interested in it yet?
No, that's right. I
Yeah.
mean, there was no opportunity to garden, and I would say, yeah, not interested in it yet.
What were some of the biggest, shocks, culture shocks that you remember from being over there? Some things that still stick with you today.
Well, I was there. I was in Europe in the second half of the 1950s, and I was principally. Well, I was in Germany for over a year, and I was in France for a couple of years, and they were both still very much in recovering from World War II, where they had just been really, destroyed by the war. So people were still quite poor. And when I was in Germany, the place, the army post that I worked at, I mean, the farmers who farmed around there, I mean, they didn't have any, well, they did have some tractors, but they also had oxen that pulled their carts. And in France, they had farm horses pulled the plows. I mean, there just was, it was sort of like had it been before the war. I mean, there was nothing. Farming was not mechanized, and people, people worked hard, and there just was, life was still hard.
Do you remember any nice little shops or markets or anything that you used to go to when you were there?
Well, not in Germany then, but when I was in France, the U.S. Army's presence was much smaller. In Germany, the U.S. Army was so big it was hard to escape from being part of that. But in France, I lived in a little village on the seacoast. I used to go to the local market. Like, have you been to Eastern Market?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, it's sort of like that. It was both inside and outside, the vendors.
What were some of the strange or unusual things that you could buy at that market that you might have not been used to? Do you remember?
Well, the fish selection was always interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I'd never lived along the coast before, so there were all kinds of fish that I'd never even seen before.
Mm-hmm. So what year did you come back to the States?
About 1959, 1960.
Mm-hmm. Did you move to Washington or
No, I went to graduate school first in Philadelphia, the University of Pennsylvania, and I was there for a year and a half to get my master's degree. And then I went to the University of Connecticut in Storrs and worked on my PhD. And I was there for quite a few years. And then I got a college teaching job.
In Connecticut?
No, in Western New York State, near Rochester, New York, at a state college.
Okay.
And I was there for 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. So that was in the mid 60s to mid 80s or approximately?
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What was New York like then? The same, just busy or?
Well, it was prosperous.
Mm-hmm.
Rochester was the home of Eastern Kodak, which is now basically collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a huge employer in Rochester. And many multi-generations of families were, Kodak families, and people worked there. And it was Xerox started there, Bausch and Lomb is there still. It's a very high-tech workforce there. And the big companies and the local merchants were very interested in making Rochester a nice place to live.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they were anti-union by and large, but they did believe in taking care of their workers. So during the Depression, when Roosevelt was in office and he wanted to start the Social Security program, Kodak was the only big manufacturing company that supported him in doing that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So where you lived in Rochester, did you feel like you had a lot of access to fresh and good food and produce, or do you remember
Hmm.
what was it like in terms of trying to get your food?
Well, I lived in the village where the college was, the town of Brockport. Then I also lived for a while in Buffalo. And then, yeah, right. And so then when I lived in Buffalo, I had a little garden, but it didn't grow very much, some flowers. And, it was just a little garden. And then when I was living back in Brockport and I bought my first house, and I had a fifth of an acre of land,
Mm.
so I had my first garden.
Okay.
And I had a pretty big vegetable garden, which I loved.
What did you start out growing in the beginning? Do you remember?
Oh yeah, well, many things. Peas, onions, radishes, squash, cucumbers, tomatoes, beans.
So when you were there, where did you get your seeds from? Were there seed stores around, or?
Yeah, I think I just bought my seeds locally. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Do you remember some of what? I mean, that kind of your first attempt at gardening.
Yeah, but that was really my first.
So do you remember
garden.
some of the mistakes that you made in that garden, or?
Well, of course I didn't make any mistake. Well, that's a good question. Mistakes. No, but I mean, I just learned a lot, but I don't remember specifically what I learned. And there was a fellow who lived just across my back street, from the back of the house, and he had a wonderful garden, and he loved gardening, and he became my mentor.
Okay.
More about ornamental gardening than vegetable gardening, although he was also a vegetable gardener.
So did you get books from the library, or how did you get more knowledge in those days? It's
I
just.
probably bought a few. I probably bought a few books.
Hmm. Yeah. So
In fact, I might still have one of them here,
really.
or I may have finally gotten rid of it. Yeah,
Oh wow.
this was one of my very first gardening books.
And this is
Very useful.
Called Down to Earth Vegetable Gardening Know-How, and it's written. Let's see. This is an old book here. This is wonderful. So
And it tells you about all the different vegetables, how to grow them, what to do for. Almost
published
everything.
in 1975.
Yeah,
Excellent.
but that's when I started my first garden,
Mhm.
1975.
So you had the one neighbor. Do you remember his name?
Sure. What was? Well, his last name was Skelton. Bob Skelton.
Okay, Bob Skelton. And were any of your other neighbors interested in gardening, or other people from the community that you remember from that time
I
period?
didn't. No, I didn't really talk with other people about gardens. Really, just Bob and I were good gardening buddies, and
Mhm.
he and his wife kind of adopted me. It
Yeah.
was really nice.
Okay. So, what year did you leave New York then?
I left in 82 or 83.
82, and you came to Washington.
I did. I
All
came
right.
on sabbatical,
All right. And
and I spent a year as a fellow at the Senate Committee on Aging, working on Medicare policy.
Okay.
And then I went back to Rochester for a few years, working at the Finger Lakes Health Planning Agency, which was the first such planning agency in the nation, and was the model for. There was health planning legislation, national health planning legislation. And then I decided to. I really loved Washington, so I came back here and said, "Well, I'm going to live in Washington, and I'll just look for a job."
What did you love about it? What stood out to you that made you want
I
to
loved the climate.
Mhm.
I liked up in the Rochester area, from late October till the end of March. You seldom see the sun, which was very depressing. And so I loved the winter. The first winter that I spent here was fantastic. I mean, there would be January, February days when you could go out with a heavy sweater on. You didn't have to be all bundled up. The sun would shine. It was beautiful. I think Washington is a beautiful city, and that is important to me. I like it that it's low rise. I like it that it has many parks. I like it that the rivers are all controlled by the government. They're not. Many places in the nation, all the river frontage is privately controlled, and ordinary people can't have no access to it.
Mm-hmm.
And, my field when I was a professor was political science. So I mean, this is where everything was happening at. So that was important. And then I lived on Capitol Hill my first year that I was here as a fellow, and I thought, gee, this is really nice. So when I came back, and I bought my house in just a year or two, and this is the house I bought.
Wow. All right.
So I bought it in '88.
88. Nice. And so in the article that you sent me, it said that you joined the King's Court Community Garden sometime shortly. It sounds like sometime shortly after you bought the house, or?
No, because it wasn't started then. I bought the house in '88, and I had my gardens front and back, but I didn't have any place to grow vegetables.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it took me a couple of years to settle in. So first I had a community garden plot in Fort DuPont,
Mm-hmm.
which is a huge community garden.
Yeah.
But really hard for somebody from the north to garden in because it's pure red clay,
Mm-hmm.
which people who know how to grow stuff in red clay can do it, but I never really figured that out. And the people who were in charge of that garden had a really very wrong-headed policy that every spring, when the ground was wet, they had the whole garden plowed. Well, there's nothing you can do worse than plow clay when it's wet, because it just turns it into cement.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a terrible thing to do. But these people who were in charge of the garden really knew nothing about gardening, but they were big into control.
Not a good combo.
No. So I was there for 3 or 4 years, and I enjoyed the gardening, but I didn't have very much produce. And then I heard from somebody over there, I guess, that there was this new garden over here, the King's Court Community Garden. So I was not in the garden the first year, but the second year, that's when I moved to it, which was 1908, and 3 other sets of gardeners also came over from Fort DuPont. Another single woman like me, and then 2 couples. And 3 of us are still in King's Court.
Okay. Do you remember the names offhand, or?
Well, I do, but I don't think I want to share them.
Okay, that's fine. So what other differences did you really notice immediately when you started gardening in Washington, D.C. as opposed to New York? And you talked about the soil. I'm sure, the seasons just altogether was longer growing season. Was there things that you were able to grow that you were excited about that you hadn't been able to before, or?
Well, certainly in ornamental gardening. I mean, Washington is a wonderful location on the East Coast if you're going to be an ornamental gardener, because the season is very long and milder. I mean, where I was living outside of Rochester, that's zone 5. This is now 7 approaching 8.
Mm.
So you can grow things from the north, things from the south. I mean, the breadth of what you can grow here is just amazing and wonderful. So that's one thing. I mean, you have a much, much longer growing season. I mean, up north, they do not have broadleaf evergreens.
Mm.
I mean, things like azaleas, those are all deciduous up there. And well, I'm just looking out into my back. I have a Paris japonica that doesn't grow up north. I have 2 azaleas that are keep their leaves all year round. Um, my nandina out front, I have a nandina hedge that doesn't grow up north. I mean, just so up the shrubs, I think particularly in the shrubs, that's where you notice a huge difference. So that's one thing, is what you can grow. Another is, and the long season. And the difference in vegetable gardening, when I had my vegetable garden at my house, outside in this college town, I had 2 feet of topsoil.
Nice.
Beautiful. And I have no idea how it came to be that way, but it was fantastic. And here, you've got red clay, right? And so most of the gardeners that I know excavate the red clay and take it off to the landfill and bring in something that is not that has very little clay in it.
Yeah.
So that's a big difference.
Okay. So, I know you said you spent a couple years at Fort DuPont, and then you moved to the King's Court.
Mm-hmm.
Were there people at either of those gardens that might have been a lot more experienced than you at the time that you might have gotten some advice from that you remember? Or
I don't remember it, but I think it's certainly once I got into King's Court Garden, there were some more experienced gardeners than I am. And one of the couples that moved over with the same time I did, moved from Fort DuPont, is the most knowledgeable gardener in King's Court, and so I have learned from her.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember and or mind sharing the names of any of the gardeners that might not be around anymore that were some of the original King's Court gardeners? Or
Well, I'd rather not do that.
okay, that's fine. So when I haven't been to the King's Court Garden yet, so I haven't actually seen this setup. Can you kind of describe what it was like in the first years?
Well, the first year when I was not there, a group of local people who were part of an urban development corporation that folded up, it was created, I'm not sure what it was created to do, but whatever it was, it didn't find a mission. But there were, I think, about a dozen people who, a local developer permitted them to garden this interior space inside the block. And so they built a fence, and they burned themselves out building the fence. It's a lot of work to build a fence.
Yeah.
And they weren't really gardeners to begin with, and there was no source of water, which was, it's the number one thing every community garden has to have access to is water.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't have such, and we didn't either the first year we were there. So, now what was the question?
Well, I was just asking you to describe it, maybe the way it looked, or how many people were there in the beginning, or.
So I don't know the first year. I think there weren't a lot of gardeners, and they didn't have much in the way of success in gardening. And then the year, I think it must have been the year, that I first went there. And we probably had about a dozen gardeners. And we decided to rototill the whole plot, and it's a fifth of an acre. Inside a block, it had been a dumping ground for who knows how long. It never had any buildings on it, but it had a lot of trash and stuff thrown in it. And so we rototilled that whole space, and the city brought over a big dumpster, and we literally filled the dumpster with debris that we took out of the garden. Old, automobile parts, toilets, motors, electrical things. I mean, a huge amount of stuff came out of there.
That sounds like a lot of work.
It was a lot of work. And then and I don't remember how this happened, but I think left over from the first year, there was a design for the community garden, a layout, which was then, even although we rototilled the whole thing, which was then recreated in this freshly tilled space. and big mistake. I don't know this, well, I do know that the young woman who developed this design in year one was in her first year in a landscape design course. And it only occurred to me 20 years later, almost, 20 years later, that her model was the L'Enfant plan. So,
The
the L'Enfant plan for the District of Columbia.
Oh, okay.
Which has, the Capitol in the middle, and then these radiating avenues that come out, and then a grid laid on top of the radiating avenues. So this garden has a main path that goes from the northeast corner to the southwest corner that runs kind of diagonally across the whole space. And then it has radiating avenues and a grid. So no plot is the same shape as any other plot, nor probably the same size, really. And even if we had water, we would not be able to pull hoses through it because of the crazy way all of these the pathways are. So, I've advised a number of community gardens that were getting started since then, and I say to them all, lay it out on a grid.
Yeah.
This is it's kind of interesting looking, but it's not very functional. So anyway, we got started in 2008 is when I went. That was a year with no water, so you had to actually carry your water. Then a neighbor said, I will allow you to hook up to my backyard spigot. So we did, and we always paid his water bill all during the gardening season. And that was the saving of our garden, because if we hadn't had water, we never could have survived.
Yeah.
So that was great.
So when you were at even Fort DuPont in early Kings Court days, where did you buy seeds and tools and supplies in the city?
Well, I don't think people sort of contributed tools. And we never. I think I had my own pitchfork and my own trowel, and I guess I had a rake. And I'm just going to get some water.
Sure.
As I say about tools, we got sort of people picked stuff up on trash day and brought it in, and people contributed tools. So we have never really bought tools for the garden. And seeds, I suppose I used to go out to Benke's, because I went to Benke's because I liked their ornamental gardens, and they had a huge selection of seeds. So that was certainly a major source of my seeds. Mostly. I think that's mostly where I got my seeds. And fertilizer and things like that. I was a big Benke patron in those days. And for one thing, I was planting my own grounds as well. So, and of course Frager's, but this is before, Frager's Burn. Did you know Frager's Burn?
Yeah, I've learned that recently.
Yeah. So that was always a source of close by for things. And early on, I just don't remember. We fill trash barrels with water, and then people take a watering can and carry it to their plot. So I think we bought those like wherever, Home Depot, Frager's, just wherever.
Yeah. When you did have to go to find vegetables or produce in your early years in DC, which did you go to the markets? Were there co-ops you went to? Was there a Giant or?
No, not co-ops. Farmers market down by the stadium. Have you ever been there?
Not to that one. I haven't.
Yeah. Well, it's a big outdoor market. The big market is on Saturdays, and then they have a small market on Thursdays. And there are some farmers that bring in plants every spring, so sometimes our people buy them there. I mean, these days, Ginkgo Gardens has them. They're down on 11th Street.
Mm-hmm.
And Frager's has a big garden section. And I just sort of, if I go out to Bengi's, I used to actually go out to Bengi's usually to buy my tomatoes because they had a big selection.
Mm.
And, some things like eggplants, the kind I wanted to get. And I would say there were years, for a number of years, Benki's was my major source of plants rather than, as well as seeds.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, I know you said that we talked about there was no water hookup in the garden. Where did you store all the tools that we collected? Did you have a tool shed in the beginning, first years? Or?
Well, actually, that's a good question. I don't know exactly when, but we were just a few years in, and the gardeners decided to build a shed. And one of the gardeners found a sort of a plan for constructing a shed, and with the metal devices that attach boards to each other and the plan. So the gardener bought that plan and those parts. And then we had any number of work days. And luckily we had in the garden an architect who knew how to construct things. And I think a couple more people who actually knew something about construction. But I will tell you that after that shed was finally finished, everybody said, no, never again.
How were they?
It was just, it was it just dragged on and on.
Yeah.
And people weren't really interested in building the shed. Right?
Yeah, just want to grow stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So how did the neighborhood? I mean, what was the relationship between the gardeners and the rest of the people in the neighborhood? Were they respectful? Was there any theft? Did people come ask questions a lot?
No, I mean, the people who had houses around the perimeter of that block, particularly the ones who backed up to that the land that we had, were really pleased that it was no longer a dumping ground,
Mm-hmm.
or a place where people could hang out and drink and smoke.
Mm-hmm.
A sort of a gathering place for lowlifes. So I think in general people were happy to have us there. But and we had a few neighbors for the block came into the garden. But although this was then a principally black neighborhood, we only ever had a couple of African American gardeners.
Mm.
And none of them lived on that around right nearby. And currently, I think it's a totally Caucasian. Well, I take it back. There's one Asian woman. I think everybody else is a Caucasian, and it's predominantly a garden of professional people.
Currently. As before, do you think it was something different?
No, I think it was always really professional people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's Fort DuPont is principally African, almost totally African American.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I'll show you across the street. There's another community garden I was involved in.
Okay. What's the name of it?
It's called Hill East.
Hill East.
Community
Okay.
Garden, and I think I don't know all the gardeners. There's one African American woman who gardens there, and has her house just around the corner here, and she's a lawyer for one of the federal agencies.
Mm-hmm. So, in one of the articles that I read about you in the garden, there was a brief description of the story about raising $2,000 in 4 days.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about that?
Well, the land on which the Kings Court Community Garden is located is a city lot, with no street. It doesn't have any street frontage. It's totally in the middle of a block. And at that time and up to now, although this is about to change, if perhaps with the change in zoning, that lot could not be built upon because the zoning regulations say you cannot build on an interior lot unless the alley access to from the street is 30 feet wide. Well, no alley is 30 feet wide from the street into the middle of the block. So the developer who owned it, I believe, had bought it thinking he would be able to build on it, and when he discovered he couldn't, he was willing to give it to a nonprofit organization, and then he would get a tax, credit for it. So he had been planning to give the money to the Urban Development Corporation, that the people who developed the garden in year one, and then kind of went away, burned out. And then when the group of which I was a part, came into the garden in year two, we didn't really know anything about the land ownership. And I don't think anybody was much concerned about it. And then, I think it was in December, I got a phone call out of the blue from a lawyer working for some law firm that had done pro bono legal work for the Urban Development Corporation. And I don't have any idea how she tracked me down, but she did, and she said, well, the thing about it is that land, the taxes are owing on that land. And if those taxes are not paid, like within a week, you could possibly lose the land. So I just, I think we must have had emails in those days, even though that would have been, people had emails.
So this is in like the mid-90s maybe?
Yeah, the late, like in 1998 probably. So I just sent out an email saying, ooh, we need some money, and within a few days, the gardeners have volunteered to contribute the $2,200 we needed to pay the back taxes.
So it was mostly actually people from the garden? Was there any outside groups that helped you?
No, it was just the gardeners.
Yeah.
People put in 100, 200, 300.
Wow.
Yeah, it was amazing. But it sort of told you immediately how much people cared about having a garden.
Yeah. So how has that played out until now? Is the ownership and all that all situated now, or what?
Yeah, well, it was quite long. It was sort of a long process. But as we learned more about the status of the land, we understood from the lawyer, I guess, that we had to, if we wanted to own the land, we had to become incorporated as a nonprofit. So we incorporated as a 501c3. Then the name of the corporation is the Capitol Hill Community Garden Land Trust. Just a big name for a little tiny organization. So originally, the only thing that land trust did was own the land for that community garden. Because once we got the corporation created, then the developer gave us the land for $1. And Sharon Ambrose was then the city council member for this ward, and she helped us get special legislation through the DC Council that, how did it work? The legislation says, as long as this land is used as a community garden, there'll be no taxes owing. When the land is transferred from the developer to the garden to the land trust, you don't have to pay the transfer taxes or some registration fee. So we have this special legislation that still stands. And so that was the initial purpose of the land trust. Then a few years later, a gardener who knew more about these unused lots in the center blocks, that found out knew that this one across the street, which I will show you, was a potential garden. And so her name was Lisa Schwartz. She's no longer in the neighborhood. But she figured out how to get that land available as a community garden, and the people who lived around there were responsible for getting them, organize themselves and so on. And that garden, well, I didn't expect this to happen, and I think I wasn't involved, and so it came as a surprise. Now, I was the coordinator of the King's Court Garden, and so then when the Land Trust was formed, then I was the president of the Land Trust, and several other gardeners were on the board of the Land Trust. So when the Hill East Garden was formed and got its land, that land was transferred to the Community Garden Land Trust. I thought it would be transferred to that garden, but it wasn't. So it's still with the Land Trust. So that's how that one got started.
So is there other gardens owned by the Land Trust now?
No, but we still hold the lease for a very big community garden just one block south of here, which is about half an acre of land, which is a huge amount of land in the middle of the city.
Which is called?
It's called the Green Seed Garden.
Green Seed Garden, all right.
And so I actually was, idle in the winter, walking around looking for possible land for for another garden, and I found that land and tracked down the Catholic Church owned it, and gosh, this must go back at least 10 years, and I, which is about the time I retired. I was probably retired by then. And so I found the land, and I found out who in the church I needed to talk to. And it was quite long and drawn out, because the church people would come down and look at that land, and they would think, we can't believe that those lots have no value. Because and next year they may be worth several hundred thousand dollars a piece, because it's a wonderful place to build a townhouse. If the zoning is changed. So, anyway, the church finally was convinced. Their law firm said, no, they have no value. Their real estate people said, no, they have no value. And so finally, the Catholic Archdiocese said, yeah, okay. So they negotiated, the Land Trust and the Archdiocese negotiated a lease agreement, to which we're both partners. And the lease said that if we could get the District of Columbia to waive their back taxes, which at that time were about $200,000, then they would give the land to the Land Trust. Well, right about then, the economy went, and the city was not in a position to waive the back taxes. But that was how that garden came about.
Okay.
And they're in the process themselves. They are now their own 501c3, the Green Seed is, and they're in the process of buying their land from the District of Columbia because of the back taxes that are owing. They will not have to pay them all, but they'll just pay a fraction of the back taxes, and they will own the land.
So, I mean, you've been heavily involved in managing and organizing and establishing gardens. Do you have any, it seems like you have a lot of different stories about that. Are there any things in particular that I might not even know a question to ask, but you have a story for, or?
Well, I would say I'm proud of what I've been able to do. And I have no responsibility for the Hill East Garden, but the big one down there, I do have a lot of responsibility for that. That wouldn't have happened without me. And I also have encouraged some neighbors who live a couple of blocks north of here. They had some empty lots in the middle of their block, and I went up there and talked to a few people, and we met, and I said, look, I think you can have a garden here. And right now, it's sort of a guerrilla garden. They're there without anybody's permission. But we have to get moving on that, because I'm pretty sure that the whoever owned those lots, and it's cut up in little tiny lots, died. The city has no address records. Nobody can locate anybody. So it will be a little more, legal work to put it all together. But I think it's very doable. And they have started a garden.
Do you think that that's the hardest part in establishing the garden is the legal side, or is probably not an interest level? It seems like, is that easier to get people that want to be involved?
It's pretty easy. The demand for community garden plots on Capitol Hill is double. I mean, if we double the amount of community garden space, they would be filled like that.
What do you have a particular reason that you think that is, or is
everybody has a waiting list?
Yeah.
And once a year, and I've been doing this for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years probably. I decided it would be a good thing for the people who are the heads of all the community gardens around here to know each other. So I started holding like a late winter meeting here at my house, and I invite the leaders of all the community gardens on Capitol Hill, which is now 10 or 11. And so they come and spend a couple of hours, and mostly what is it? The new people in the job, or the new gardens, ask questions of the old garden. So it's a very valuable information exchange. Then I also collect from them all the contact information about their gardens and how much it costs and how long is their waiting list. And I think did I send you that list?
I don't.
I might not have, but I send it all of the garden coordinators get that list every year. And whenever anybody applies to King's Court to get on the waiting list, I say, sadly, we are filled and we have a waiting list, but I'd be glad to add you to the waiting list, and I'm attaching the list of all the other community gardens on Capitol Hill, and you may want to apply to some of those.
Yeah.
And I can give you that list if it's something you'd like to have.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So that's another thing I do.
Approximately how many people are on the King's Court waiting list?
Well, this year we've gone through a lot. When we started the season, it was about 35, and then it turns out about half of the people have either moved or they're not interested. So we're now down to about 20.
Yeah, okay.
Because we added quite a few new gardeners this year. Well, we probably had 6 or 7 plots become available, and we only have a total of 32, so that's a big percentage. But we had a lot of turnover this year. People move away principally.
Is what are the regulations? King's Court is. It's not part of the National Park Service.
No.
So you have your own
We have our
independent
own
rules.
Right, which have grown up over the years.
Yeah. How have things shifted? Is there any regulations in terms of like organic? I know some gardens are.
Well, we don't say organic, but we say no. You can't use, if you're going to use pesticides, you have to use organic pesticides. What you put on in terms of fertilizer or anything, that's up to you. But we don't want limited pesticides and only organic ones. So, and pretty much, some years we bought a load of compost and we make sure that it's good, coming from a reliable source. But one thing I would say about, this is sort of changing the subjects a little bit, but back to the garden. I told you that we said we'd never build another shed or not build another project. About 3 or 4 years ago, the original fence was really falling apart. Might be 5 years now. So we brought this, we have an annual meeting, and about 20 or 25 gardeners come to the annual meeting. That's out of a total of more than 50. And because the board had talked about it and said, yes, we need a new fence, and so we took it to the annual meeting and said we need a new fence, and we proposed to raise the money in several ways. One, we would ask the Capitol Hill Community Foundation for a grant, and they have been very supportive of community gardening and that foundation, and they give maximum grants of $2,500. So we got a $2,500 grant from them. Then we asked all the gardeners who could afford it to make a contribution, and suggested, I've forgotten what we suggested as an amount, that if you could do it, the old gardeners who were there were grandfathered in with double plots, and the newer gardeners have single plots.
Mhm.
So there are about 10 original gardeners. So we suggested, I think, that they give $200 or $300, and that people with a single plot give $100 or $150. And I think we raised about $3,000 that way. And then, or even maybe more, some other people gave more than we suggested. And then we had some money in our budget that had been, when we paid those back taxes, when we got the land, the money was given back to us by the city. So then we had that, $2,200 was in our treasury. So we used some of that.
Nice.
But again, it was easy. It was an easy thing to do to raise the money.
Yeah, it sounds like you're pretty good at that.
Well, it's just, I think these are people who are, a lot of them earn big money.
Yeah, there's a lot of people out here that earn a good living. So what about some more of the other rules at the King's Court Garden? Or do you have, some places have inspections and, things
Well, we
like
sort
that?
of have inspections, but it isn't, I keep an eye on the garden. Now it's pretty well established, and I think the gardeners pretty much know what they're supposed to do. But I always enlist another member of the board, and once a year or twice a year we walk through the garden and make sure things are looking pretty good. And if there's any gardener that I think is really not keeping their plot up, then I get a couple of the other board members to look at it with me. And we sort of, we put the gardener on notice and say, if you don't shape up, and here's, by this date, we're going to have to be, consider taking your plot away from you, which is pretty much all anybody needs.
Is that very common, though?
No, but we've had a few gardeners that just didn't do it, and were asked to leave the garden. But we have, but the rules are all kind of common sense. There are pathways between the plots, and the gardeners are expected to maintain the pathways so that people can move through the garden. I would say the one innovation of recent years that has really worked well was how to get everybody to help do the common work of the garden. When we were a new garden, probably the first 5 or 6 years, and we would have a work day, we'd have a couple of work days in the spring and a couple in the fall. We had a great turnout, and it was kind of nice. A lot of people would come out, and then the kind of gardeners, the family situations, I would say, of the gardeners has really changed over the years. When we first started, these were I think we only had one gardening couple who had young children, and everybody else either had teenage children or no children. They were old. I think the gardeners were older. Their kids, if they had them, were sort of grown up, or nearly grown up. And now we have a lot of gardeners with small children. And this part of the hill is full of families with little children, which it was not when we started. This was not a place that people were interested in living to bring up children. It was still very active open air drug markets all around here. Gunshots in the night. It was, kind of scary.
Yeah.
And people who either planning to have children or had little children did not move here. And now it's become a very in place.
Yeah.
I mean, the neighborhood is full of double strollers.
Dogs.
Dog, yeah. Well, there were always dogs.
Smaller, kinder, nicer dogs.
Yeah. So I mean, then it was really problematic. We'd have a work day, and maybe 5 of the old gardeners would come, and none of the new gardeners would come.
Mm-hmm.
So another member of the board said, I'll tell you what, I will develop a list of tasks that need to be done, that is for the community garden, not on your own plot, and everybody will have to sign up for. If you have one plot, you have to sign up for one. If you have double plot, you have to sign up for 2. And that has really worked well. Now, there's been a real loss of community because people who are just very busy lives, they don't really get together very much.
Mm-hmm.
But, that's the fact of the matter.
So you're saying that depending on how many plots you have to sign up or mark off your name once you've completed a task?
Well, when you register every spring, you have to register and pay your fee.
Mm-hmm.
It's $35 for a single plot, $70 for a double plot, which is cheap. The other gardeners, all the other gardens, charge more than that.
Mm-hmm. And
we don't have any initiation fee either, which a number of the other gardeners do. So as part of the registration form packet, there's a list of all of the tasks, and whether it's a full season task or a half season task, whether it's worth 1 credit or 2 credits. And in order to register, you have to indicate what you want to do, but you have to indicate your first choice, your second choice, and your third choice. And then, so all the stuff comes in, and I figure out who will do what, and then we just send the list out to everybody and post it, and that has it worked really well.
Gotcha. So let's talk about some of your gardening techniques. How would you describe your approach? I don't want to try to label your your gardening approach.
Well, I'm a believer, and I don't follow through on this, but I believe in no-till gardening. Have you know about no-till gardening?
A little bit. I don't till my plot, unlike there's a lot of people that till like 6 times before they even plant something. I try not to do that.
Well, the theory of no-till gardening is that if you don't disturb the soil, this is good, because undisturbed soil develops air channels and water channels, and healthy microorganisms develop down there. And every time you dig up the soil, you destroy all that. Mm-hmm. And so in no-till gardening, and this is particularly more applicable if you're putting in big plants, like you're putting in tomatoes, or you're putting in, they're not so big, but eggplants or peppers or cabbages or whatever. You buy the plant, and you're going to put the plant in the ground rather than seeds. You don't dig it up at all. You just make a hole big enough to put your plant into, and you put your plant in it. You might put some fertilizer in there or some compost, and that's it. And then, because the soil is not disturbed on top, you don't uncover weed seeds, so you have many fewer weeds. Mm-hmm. And you have happier soil, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So, as I say, I'm a believer in this. I don't, not always faithful to it, but so I would say that's one of the things I think is important. And I'm currently thinking, I heard a lecture in the winter from somebody who was very knowledgeable. He said most people fertilize too much. Mm-hmm. So I decided to do less of that. He said, and I think it seems to be working out all right.
Are there any particular types or methods for fertilizing, or? Well,
I use Osmocote, this little pelletized fertilizer. Okay. The thing that's nice about pelletized fertilizer You could just sprinkle it in the hole, you can sprinkle it on the ground, it doesn't burn anything, and it lasts slow release. So it's good for the whole season, or half the season. And if I buy bagged fertilizer, I buy Espoma, because Espoma is organic, which is much better than buying chemical fertilizers. I mean, they're all chemicals, but and compost. I always use compost, and I buy usually Leaf Grow, which is made in Maryland, and it's all, they test the balance, the pH balance in it, and and it's done so there's no weed seeds in it. It's really good.
So do you have a compost pile here or at your house, or do you bury your weeds, or how do you?
I have a little rotating composter out back of my fence.
Is there one at King's Court? Do you guys do compost?
Well,
piles?
we've had compost piles, but this is really hard. One, it's hard to get. One doesn't want to be out there going, don't do that. People don't. Most of the people in the garden don't understand what you should put in the compost and what you shouldn't. So they put in giant things that will never, compost in 3 or 4 years. They put woody things in. They don't cut it up. They put in plants full of weed seeds. They put in tomato plant parts that are full of diseases. And our compost piles don't get hot, so they're not going to kill any of that stuff. So that's a problem. Then this year we had a particular problem, which is that the alley that we're located in is rat-ridden. We had lots of rats this spring. And we discovered that we had rats living under our compost piles. As well as in one gardener's plot, because he'd like to bring his garbage from home and bury it. The rats like that too, so they were living in his plot. So one of the gardeners who's had connections arranged to have a man come and literally remove all of our compost bins right down to the ground, so there were no rats who could be living under them. And we've started compost bins again, and I'm not sure. I know that the bins at the other end that I'm not involved in are not being taken care of, and the ones that down where I am are sort of being taken care of. But I'm not sure, and I don't care to use that compost myself, because I know I know there's stuff in it I don't want to put on my plot.
Sounds very similar to where I garden. Do the rats affect your food? I mean, do they steal your tomatoes?
What do you think? Rats and squirrels. We have a big squirrel population. This year they're eating all the tomatoes like mad. So those kind of orangey ones with green stripes, those are from my plot. And I was on vacation. I came back and I had my best tomato head was written. I said enough was eaten. So now I read for somebody at the University of Maryland Extension Services said, pick your tomatoes as soon as they start to color up, and bring them in the house and ripen them in the house. So that's what I'm going to do, because I'm damned if I'm going to let the squirrels have my tomatoes.
The ones that are the ripest are the ones that are being eaten.
Exactly. So I think this is I'm going to see how they taste, but they seem to be ripening pretty well. I mean, these tomatoes here. Those two I bought, but all the others are from my. These are all from my plot.
Yeah.
And they seem to be ripening just fine.
So what else are the main crops that you always grow? Everyone does tomatoes. Do you do fall and spring?
Well, yeah, I do. In the spring I plant radishes always, lettuces of various kinds. I gave up on cucumbers. There's always succumbed to cucumber wilt. I said, no, I gave that up. I didn't plant any zucchini or summer squash, but now I have just planted some because I heard that the squash vine borer is gone by the beginning of July. Then I just read from the University of Maryland Extension, yeah, the squash vine borer is gone, but there's a squash beetle maybe around. You can't win for losing. I usually plant pole beans, as I like green beans. And, I plant things to kind of amuse myself. Some years I plant okra, which has beautiful flowers. Last year, sometimes I try and plant some brassicas in the fall. And I just have some seeds that I planted out back that I'm going to start, some cabbage and some broccoli. And some Asian greens. Asian greens are great. You can plant them kind of late August, and then they will go into probably almost December, maybe with just a little piece of row cover over. I plant frisee lettuce because that will live through the winter, and I like frisee. I usually have a few pepper plants. Oh, I like beets. I discovered roasting beets, and they're delicious. So I plant carrots, plant scallions. Whatever.
Is there anything besides cucumbers that you just don't do anymore that you tried?
Yeah, I'm not
squash.
On squash. Eggplants are hard because the flea beetles really decimate baby eggplants. I mean, I have a method of swaddling them in row cover from the time they go in the ground till the blossoms come, but it's a lot of work, so I didn't do that. This year was a busy year for me. As you can see, I renovated my house.
It looks nice, yeah.
And I was totally absorbed in that this year.
Just forgot what I was going to ask you. So, do you follow like a specific planting schedule, or how do you determine when you plant your?
Well, I read various things, so I don't have a set schedule, but I kind of, I sort of read various, like the University of Maryland has a newsletter, and they say, well, this is the time you plant this and this. And I've been vegetable gardening for about 30 years now, so I have a pretty good idea of season things. One thing, one of my newest things that I really like are these little white Japanese turnips. Turnips in 30 days, little sweet white ones. So I will be planting those in a couple of weeks, and then in 30 days I'll have turnips, which is kind of neat. So I experiment with. Oh, and I grow garlic. I grow gourmet garlic, and I usually grow 5 or 6 varieties, and it's actually on the floor over there.
What are some of the different? I know there's red garlic, like jumbo, and
no, these are actually named varieties, sort of like, like if you grow beets, you could grow early wonder beets or bull tardy beets or bull's blood beets. Okay, well, and garlic is the same. There are named varieties, and so like I grow rosewood and trillium, chestnut red. I used to grow Persian star. So like that.
Okay.
So that's kind of. I do it because it's amusing, really.
Yeah, it's nice to have a variety of stuff and accumulate, get a different taste for them. What are some of the ways you like to prepare this stuff? Do you eat mostly salads, or do you have any?
Eat a lot of salad. Yeah, I roast vegetables. I do stir fries.
Okay.
And I usually, about the garlic, I'll have a garlic tasting. I'll invite some friends over. Of roasted garlic. It's a kind of a quiz.
Yeah.
It's sort of a blind tasting. It's sort of an amusing thing to do.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah.
So, what do you think about the current state of King's Court? I mean, are you happy where it is? Are there things that you wish were happening that weren't? What's your vision for the future of King's Court? Or any of the other gardens that you've been
Yeah,
involved in?
well, I think King's Court is, it's pretty stable now. Um, we always have a few people the newest people come in, they're new and they're learning, and that's good. And everybody, I always say, ask the people around you. People are very willing to help you, and I try to introduce them to garden neighbors who would, say, this is a person to get in touch with if you have any questions. And some years I've been a little more formal about that, asking, old gardeners will you be willing to be a garden neighbor to new gardeners? But it's, people are there because they love it. So everybody respects the garden. And the fence is pretty high. It's 6 or 7 feet high, and it's locked. And I wouldn't have a garden here in any other way than to have a high fence and locks around it. Because I'm on the email for the big garden that's south of here, and somebody wrote on their email list, well, she had come into the garden and there were some kids just running around and, pulling up plants and throwing tomatoes, and I thought, yeah, well, that's the problem.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
So it sounds like you have a good faith
We don't have very many small children in our garden. That's actually, I like about that garden. It's a kid-friendly garden, and that was the way it started. They wanted to have children involved in it. And I think that was a really nice thing about that garden. But, yeah, and we had a gardener in our garden who had a couple of children that were really poorly behaved. And she allowed them to go into the garden on their own, and we finally said, you can't do that because they're taking things out of other people's plots, they're destructive.
So, this is a question I kind of skipped over earlier, you said you've been gardening here for about 30 years in this area?
I've been gardening 25 years in this area.
So, in the last 3 years I've been in DC, the weather's been different every year.
Yeah, that's right.
How does that compare to your experience over those 25 years?
Oh, the weather has been so erratic. It's not like that. 10 years ago, we didn't have such violent shifts back. We had a month here when it rained and rained and rained and rained, and then it stopped raining and got hot, 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 hot. No rain. Yeah. So that's, I think climate change is real, and I think it's going to be much harder to garden.
Great. Well, we've covered quite a bit of stuff
We
here.
have.
Was there anything that you feel like I left out, or anything you wanted to add that you thought of? Or?
I do want to add something. And this because a couple of people had said to me, well, would you be willing to talk about community gardening and all of its sort of good, community, how it builds community, and it's basically whoever the people posing these questions. Somebody wants me to come and talk to his class down at GW, I think. He has a romanticized idea of what this is all about and why people are doing it. People do not come into the community garden to make friends and be part of a community. It's nice if it happens, and it was really nice in the early days of our garden. That really did happen, and I really like that. And I'm sorry that it's gone. But it's gone, and it is really because we have all these young families that are. If you are a two employed professionals family, and you've got 2 kids, you don't have any time to. There's one fellow I know in the garden. He gardens at 10 o'clock at night.
Wow.
And another guy who's got 3 or 4 kids, he comes in at 6 o'clock in the morning, and then he goes to work. These are people with hugely busy lives. So I think, and I've been thinking, and I'm going to ask people about this. I haven't decided whether I'll do exactly how I'll do it, whether I have a questionnaire or what, but about why do people garden? It's not for community, mostly. It might be, it certainly wasn't that garden down there when it was new, and to some extent it may be now, because their parents were kids, so the kids are friends. But I would say in my garden, well, I think a fair number of people garden because they enjoy the solitude of it.
Mm-hmm.
When you come to that garden, often you're the only person there, or there are other gardeners, but they're not there to visit.
Mm-hmm.
They're there to poke around in their plot and think whatever they want about whatever they want.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't to be social. Obviously, everybody is there. They enjoy the produce, and that's a major motivator. But I think just sort of peaceful time and sort of making things grow, the pleasure of having things grow. Certainly, that's really true for me. Now, in our garden, we do have all summer long, all season, we have a potluck every month, as I told you, and we have a happy hour every month. Now, the average turnout is about 10 people. If we have 12 or 14, that's unusual.
Mm-hmm.
So it's and it's pretty much the same people come every time. Mm-hmm. The old-time gardeners, kind of older couples or older singles. And so it's not the people with kids, in other words.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for those of us who enjoy those, that's an important part of the garden for me. But as I say, not a lot of people do.
Yeah.
And I think for the families, having fresh produce, fresh organic produce for themselves and their children, I think that is important to them.
Yeah, I agree.
But it's not a big romantic thing with them. It's a very pragmatic thing.
Yeah, you actually get dirty when you do it.
Right? Yeah.
All right. Well, I think I'm about out of questions.
Okay. Well, I've enjoyed this, Josh.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for.
We've talked for a very long time.
It has been a while, so we're gonna wrap it up. I'd like to thank Pat again, and thank you all for listening.
And we can walk across.